So we're back with lesson 1, part 2. We did a little kind of preliminary research about ASP.NET on our Miro board. I'm going to go over, kind of fill in some of the gaps, give you a little bit more background on the technology that we're going to be using, what are some of the things that it offers for us, and how does it work. Okay, so these slides are here on Blackboard. It's not too long, there's only 9 of them. Okay, so the technology is mature. It's actually 20 years old, 19 years old. I actually bought the first version of Visual Studio 2002 back in 2002. I paid $1,700 US for my copy of Visual Studio back then. And it was based on an older Microsoft technology called Active Server Pages. So that's where the name comes from. So very occasionally you might see like a 20-year-old Microsoft site with a .8 where pages have .asp file extensions. And with ASP, the language was VB script, so a form of Visual Basic, and it was interpreted. So very similar to PHP, just with kind of a little bit of a simpler syntax. So Microsoft ran with ASP for several years, and in 2002, they totally overhauled their web programming platform, and they offered a few things that we didn't really have before. The first one was compiled web code. So we could write our server-side code in Visual Basic or in C#, but that code would get compiled down to 1s and 0s. So that way it runs much faster. It's also a lot more secure. And we'll see this code compilation, how this works in the next class or two. It also incorporated object-oriented principles into web programming, which didn't really exist widely before. And it allowed us to write one application and deploy a front end for web and another front end for the desktop. So that was kind of a lot of the goals way back when ASP.NET was launched. They added MVC 13 years ago, back in 2008. And all of this was the .NET framework. 5 years ago, they created .NET Core. They decided to open source and make ASP.NET cross-platform. And .NET Core is now kind of the preferred, the common way of building apps in .NET. Where do we find .NET? We find it everywhere, but we see it especially in medium and large enterprises. So lots of government, big corporations use ASP.NET. And it gives us a lot of stuff as web developers. So I already mentioned the code compilation. We're going to use Visual Studio, which is a super powerful, probably the most powerful coding development environment. All kinds of tools and plugins available for us to use. It also automates a lot of things. So many of the things we had to do manually when we were working in PHP, Visual Studio will do for us automatically, which saves us a lot of time, lets us be a lot more productive. We're going to leverage the MVC pattern, which we'll look more carefully at in a bit. And it also integrates well with a lot of other Microsoft products, and we're going to use all of these. We're going to use SQL Server for our database. We're going to host our applications in this course in the cloud on Microsoft's Azure Cloud Service. So we're going to follow some DevOps principles. You guys are going to learn about that. And again, integrates with GitHub, which you already know, another Microsoft product. ASP.NET has a really kind of sophisticated security model. We won't use all of these things, but we're going to use some of these features later on in the course when we look at implementing security. Yeah, Microsoft bought GitHub 2 or 3 years ago, actually. There's not really, Kathleen, it's not very obvious. You'd actually really never know, but it integrated really well. Yes, Raymond, you could have. It integrated really well before, but it integrates even better now that it's another Microsoft product. So one of the great things that this allows us to do, for example, when we host in the cloud, is we use this, what's called the Devops approach, which means we can create our project in Visual Studio, we can push it to GitHub, and we can connect our Azure website to our GitHub repository for continuous deployment. So every time we push a new version to GitHub, Azure will automatically sync and reload, serve up the latest version of our Git repository. So we'll do that in a few weeks. Okay, Felix, what's the difference? Visual Studio Code is simply a code editor. Okay? Visual Studio offers far more. So it offers things like project templates with a lot of pre-built code. It has a whole bunch of other tools for doing things like automated testing. It has a graphical user interface if we want to build desktop applications. So Visual Studio has far more, and it has far more graphical tools. In Visual Studio, everything is kind of either done in code or through the terminal, whereas Visual Studio has those features, but it has far more. So we're not going to use Visual Studio Code for this course. We're using the full-blown Visual Studio. So some of the things Visual Studio offers, one of the great things it offers is runtime debugging. So Visual Studio was the first web code environment that allowed us to do this. What's runtime debugging? It means we can start to load a page in our browser, and then we can actually walk through the server-side code line by line as it executes. So we can evaluate variables, we can watch how decisions go, and we can see our code execute one line at a time, which makes debugging and solving problems much easier. Comes with all kinds of project templates for building MVC web applications, building APIs, or even building websites using a JavaScript front-end framework or library like Angular or React. We're not going to use these two templates, but we are going to use these. It includes things like Bootstrap jQuery and a site layout automatically, so we don't have to include those things or build them manually. It's got all kinds of libraries and tools for all sorts of security measures like pre-built registration and login, enabling two-factor or social authentication, and we're going to use a lot of these. We've got a package manager, so we can add in third-party libraries, we can do automated testing, and we've got integration, really good integration with Git and GitHub for version control. Okay. So, like I said, this is like driving the motorcycle. It's not like PHP Storm, where we're just writing code in our editor. We can write code in Visual Studio, but we can do so much more. So we touched a little bit on our whiteboard about MVC, but I want to dive into it a little more detail, because we're going to use MVC in this class. We're also going to use it in our JavaScript class next semester. So here's how MVC works. For the visual learners, we've kind of got this relationship between our models, views, and controllers. So let's take a look at this URL that I've got here. I'll throw it in the chat, but you can see it on my screen on the slide deck. One of the great things about the MVC pattern and the way it works, particularly with ASP.NET, is that we have friendly descriptive URLs, right? So our web addresses, they actually give an indication of what should happen. So what would you expect to see at this URL? I mean, the address itself is fairly descriptive. So what do you think would happen here? Some website /order/details and then a number. What would happen on that page? Would you get a login screen? Okay, if the page loaded and wasn't 404, what would you expect based on the information in the URL? What would you expect to see? Would you see a discussion board? Would you see a login screen? Would you see a photo gallery? What kind of content would render on that page? Yeah, exactly. It would show us the information, as Tushar, Jennifer, and David's mentioned. Yeah, it would show us the information about from the orders table with the record with the ID of 1000. Right? So the URL patterning matters a lot. So MVC, it does a lot of stuff for us automatically, but it wants us to follow a set of naming conventions and rules. So the first part of we've got our root domain. And then after the first slash, this is always going to tell us which controller, which logic file is going to process the request. So if we see a URL like this, /orders, that means we're going to have a controller in a controllers folder called the orders controller with the CS extension. The next part of the URL is the method or action or function that gets called inside of this controller. So in our orders controller, we're going to have a method called details. And then the last piece of the URL is passing a parameter, an ID of 1000. So the URL not only sets out an expectation to the user of what would happen, but it's actually this URL is dispatched to the controller. It's a set of instructions. Which controller will process the request, which method inside that controller should execute, and if there's any information this method needs, all of these are part of the URL. So then this request gets sent to our orders controller, to the details method, and that ID of 1000 comes in. So what does the controller have to do? What happens inside this details method so that we can display order 1000 back to our user? What would the details method actually do? If you look at the diagram kind of shows you. Right. Exactly, Tushar. It's going to use the order model, which will be here in models. We're going to have a file called order.cs. This is going to pass in ID 1000. The model is going to talk to our database, fetch order 1000. It's going to pass the order information back to the controller. So now the controllers use the model to request info from the database. The model serves it back to the controller. And the last thing that happens is the controller is then going to load a view. And the file path is going to be views, orders, and it's going to load this view file, details.cshtml. So it is an HTML file, but it has a special extension, CSHTML. So this file can include both regular HTML as well as server-side code. So we load the view and we pass it the order so that the user can see the details of their order. So what would be some of the benefits? So let me just pull up, let me just load a file from last semester here. Go to my GitHub page. I'm going to open up one of our PHP files. Here was our PHP gaming site. So let's see, we had our games. Page from last semester. So this page queried the database and showed a list of games in PHP. So this is functional. What would be some of the reasons to break this up into this structure, where we've got our data, interaction, our logic, and our view? What are the benefits of using this kind of pattern as opposed to this? So using this MVC pattern, it offers quite a few benefits. Can you think of any? Yeah, it's simpler to, yep, that's right. We can secure it. So we can keep, for example, the database interaction code separate. Yep, those are great answers, Tushar. Anybody else? Anything else you can think of why would splitting up the HTML presentation, the database interaction, and the logic into separate files that work together? Tushar's given a couple good answers. What if you're working in a team? Yeah, Felix, that's right. It's much easier to see the flow. Yep. What if we're working in a team? Maybe Tushar, Felix, and me are building this application together. Right, David, right? We can say, Felix can say, I'm the database guy. I'm touching the models. Tushar, Rich, you don't touch the model files. I will handle all of the interaction with the database. And maybe Tushar says, I'm the front end guy. So I don't want you guys messing around in the views. I will deal with the presentation layer. And I say, I'm doing the logic. So it's easier to edit the individual parts. It's easier to separate the work, right? In a file like this one in PHP, all of this stuff is together, right? We've got some server-side code. We've got database code. We've got SQL queries. We've got HTML presentation, looping, error handling. Very difficult to divide this work. This would also make testing and debugging much easier. How come? How does splitting up the logic, data, and presentation into separate files, separate components, make it easier? Yep, the files get messy. That's right, Felix, we can spread it. So if we have an error with the database or our data query, we know the problem is in the model. We don't have to look through, we don't have to look in the view or look in the controller. So it makes finding and fixing errors and isolating them easier. Yeah, absolutely, Ariel, that's right. We've also got more eyes to see where the problem is. That's a good point. It also means we can swap or reuse these components easily. So I'm giving you a couple examples. Let's say we have in one application we build for a client, let's say we have they want a newsletter online. We could build a newsletter model, and then we've got a controller that fetches, creates newsletters and a set of views for displaying or creating them. But let's say we then have another client who also wants newsletters. Maybe the backend code, the model and controllers, the logic and the data is the same, but we can then just create a set of different views. We can then just reuse the models and controllers in another project. Or we build a web application, and then we want to build a mobile app. We can use the same backend controller and model, and instead of making the views web pages, the views could be iPhone screens or Android activities, for example. So it lets us reuse our code. So we're going to learn MVC and use it in this course, and it will take a little while to get used to, but it's actually quite easy. And then you're going to see MVC used everywhere with all kinds of languages and platforms. So it creates what we've called separation of concerns. Code is modular, we can reuse, we can divide the work, and it makes it easier for us to find and fix problems. So most people takes a little while to get used to using this pattern, but most people love it once they get the hang of it. And Visual Studio will actually build this structure for us, which is great. If you want another resource, there's a little video here. Let's see how long it is. If it's, so you can, they've now made it private. That's too bad. So you will get comfortable with MVC quite quickly. Okay, we'll come back to this. Okay, so what we want to do is let's play around just a little bit with Visual Studio. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to kind of make a throwaway project today. But what I want to show give you a little tour of Visual Studio, look at the structure of an MVC web application, and then play around with it a little bit. We'll modify it and we'll see how do the parts of an MVC app talk together. So let's open up Visual Studio. And when it opens, we want to create a new project. Now, there are many different types of project templates here. Can be a little bit overwhelming, but we can actually narrow down this list. So in the top, you've got this search box, search for templates. If you just type ASP.NET, what we want is this one. It's got a long name, ASP.NET Core Web App MVC. And the description is a project template for creating an ASP.NET Core web application with example MVC views and controllers. It can also be used for building RESTful HTTP services, which we'll do towards the end of the course. So again, I'll put in the chat the option, but you can see it highlighted on my screen. ASP.NET Core Web App Model View Controller. So this is the template you want. And the language should be C#. Occasionally I have students accidentally pick Visual Basic. We're only working with C# in this class. C# is very similar syntax-wise. It's based on C, so the syntax is very similar to PHP. It's very similar to Java. So you don't really need to learn a new language. So once you pick this template, and notice it's for any operating system, you can click the Next button. I'm not keeping this project. We'll make our kind of keeper project next week, so I'll just call it a Thursday lesson 1. And we should never have spaces. Yep, Jennifer, you got a question? Okay. So give your project a name. You can call it anything you like. As I said, this is just kind of like a test project. Click the Next button. Now, there are a few options here that we want to set. We should be using version 5 of the .NET framework, which is the latest. If you don't see version 5, that's fine for today. You can use version 3.3 or 2. We will need version 5 moving forward. Is there anybody who does not have version 5 here in the target framework? If you don't have it, I will show you where you can download it. Again, not critical for today. Okay, looks like everyone has version 5. Good. Now, authentication type defaults to none. So everything in the website is public. We're going to change this. So instead of none, we're going to pick individual accounts. This means we want to be able to store users in our database. We're not going to do it today, but we'll configure it this way. The other option, which we should get used to, and we talked about this in our PHP class, is we want to configure our site to use HTTPS. So it runs with using SSL, which we talked about last semester. We'll talk about it again. So not critical for today, but generally this configure for HTTPS, we want to make sure that box is checked. We don't need Docker. We don't need Razer runtime compilation. So I would recommend using these options. .NET 5, individual accounts for authentication, configure for HTTPS. When you've got those checked, you can click the Create button down at the bottom right. So I'm going to click the Create button, and we will let Visual Studio do its magic. So it'll take a minute for our project to create. And over here on the right, excuse me, I have this little window called Solution Explorer. So this is like a list of all the files and folders in the project. So we'll poke around and explore here. So we actually have a site, but how do we see it? This is one of the other great things about developing with Visual Studio. You'll remember in our PHP class, I was using PHP Storm. Some of you were using Visual Studio Code for your editor, but we also had to install XAMPP. So we had to install a separate web server and start it up anytime we wanted to work on our PHP site. Visual Studio comes with its own web server called Iis Express. So Iis is Microsoft's production web server. So the Express is like a light version, and it's integrated right into Visual Studio. So if I want to run this website and start my server, the easiest way to do this is up here on the debug menu. I want to choose this option, this start without debugging. I'll explain the difference between start debugging and start without a bit later, but normally we want to choose start without debugging. This is going to start our local web server and launch it in the browser. So let's see what happens when we do that. So debug, start without debugging, and I get this. Now this warning is nothing to panic about. It says potential security risk. If I click advanced, it's giving me this warning, but it says our SSL security certificate is invalid because it's self-signed, meaning we're using SSL from Visual Studio. The browser wants our SSL certificates to come from some recognized certificate authority like VeriSign or a company like that, or GoDaddy. We don't care. This is fine. This is our own certificate. There's no danger. So I'm going to click accept and continue. So again, I just clicked advanced in the security warning. If you're using, this is what Firefox says, if you're using a different browser, the warning may be a little different. So I'm going to accept it. And here's what Visual Studio gave us. We actually have a working website. There's a header with register and login. There's a footer with the current year, the name of our project. And there are a couple of pages in the site. I've got a privacy policy and a home page. What happens if I click register? We've got a pre-built user registration page. We've also got a pre-built login page. And we've got things like forget password. So all of this is here with the template we picked. When we pick that ASP.NET Core MVC web application, Visual Studio gives us all of these starter files. It even gives us this. It's mobile responsive using Bootstrap and jQuery with our little collapsible menu. Everything fits to scale. So we can customize. We're going to want to make a lot of changes to this, but this is a great starting point for an application. This saves us tons of time. If you think about how we had to build applications in PHP, we had to do all this stuff manually. Does anybody, any questions so far before we sort of start poking through the structure and then making some changes?
So I'm at the ASP.NET core, and that's where we all start, right?
Well, you make a new project.
Yes, I made a new project.
Okay, so does your screen look, okay, so your screen looks something like mine right now?
Yep.
Okay, so to start it, you click the debug menu and then choose start without debugging. Felix, yes, you can say yes to that.
I don't have start without debug. I don't have the start without debugging button.
Okay, do you have start debugging?
No, all I have is Windows, exception settings, XAML binding failures, show diagnostic tools, performance filer, attached to process, other debug targets.
Okay, let's try this first then. Chris, do you have a build menu?
Yes.
Okay, so click build solution.
Got that.
Okay. Do you see debug beside it now or no?
No, I don't see the start debugging part.
Okay. All right. I had some students have this issue on Tuesday. Let's do this. If you don't see that, click on File and close your solution. If you have the debug, then you don't have to do this. So click File and close solution. And then, Chris, it should bring you to a screen like this.
Yep.
And your project should be right here on the top left. So let's reopen it. Just click it to reopen.
Oh, it's fixed.
Yeah.
Start debugging. This
Yeah.
project is configured. Start without.
Yeah. Start without debugging is generally preferable. But if you chose start debugging, that's fine too. That will also work.
Start without debugging. Configure
Yep.
to use SSL. Click on yes.
Yep.
You are install a certificate from a certification authority. Do you want to install localhost?
Yeah. Say yes.
Advanced.
Yep.
Accept the risk and continue.
You got it.
I'm all caught up.
Good. Okay, so let's have a look at what did we actually get here. So what's in the project? We've got dependencies and packages. So these are libraries that we're going to use later. So entity framework, that's for connecting to our database. And these couple packages that have the word identity, these are for security. So those built-in register, login, forget password pages, the code that runs those is in these libraries. And then we have a couple of other packages for working with our SQL Server database. The properties we don't really need to worry about. That's just for hosting. Under www root, we've got folders for CSS and JavaScript. So we've got a default style sheet already here. So if you want to make changes to some of the styles, you can. Let's say, I want to make all of my links, I want to make all my links red. I can change the style sheet. Visual Studio nicely shows me which line I change. It puts a little green mark here, which is useful. And now all my links are red. So we can make whatever changes we want to this default style sheet. Add any classes, make any changes we want. We have a default client-side JavaScript file called site.js. So any JavaScript functions we want to add, we can put in here. And then we've got libraries like Bootstrap, jQuery, jQuery validation. Again, we don't have to keep these. If we want to remove them, we can get rid of them. But it's convenient to have these things already included in our project. Saves us time having to go download them or use CDNs. Under the areas section under identity, this is where we can add anything related to security. So all the pre-built templates for things like registering and logging in. The controllers, this is kind of the heart of the application, because the controllers, this is our logic, right? The controller kind of does all of the interpreting of URLs, sends instructions to the database, and then decides what views to load and what data, how to interact with data in the views. So we have one controller here already called home controller. And in here, we're going to see two methods. We've got a method called index, and we've got a method that returns a view, and we have a method called privacy that also returns a view. We'll play around with this a little bit more in a bit. We've got models. Well, we don't have any models because we're not working with the database. Yes, Colton, I am, but thank you for checking. And then in here, we've got our views. And notice we have a controller called home, and we've also got a views. And notice the names. Our home controller has a method called index and a method called privacy. Inside of views and home, we've got a web page called index and one called privacy. So wherever we've got a method in the controller, we've got a view with the same name. Okay, so that naming convention is important. So let's look, right? When I click privacy, notice the URL /home. So there's our controller, and then /privacy. So this URL, what happens? It calls the privacy method of the home controller, and it returns the view with the same name. Okay, so the URL pattern dictates what happens in the MVC framework. Make sense so far? I know it's new. It's a little bit of a different way of thinking about web applications, but we're going to practice and practice with it, and it will become pretty second nature. I just need to plug my machine in so it doesn't die on us. Okay, yeah, we will. That's fine. I know we'll talk through some of the code. So let's customize. Now we've also got, I should explain. So notice actually, if we take a look, so here's the home page. So most of this is standard HTML, right? We've got a welcome in an H1. We're using Bootstrap classes. And then we've got this paragraph tag here. I click on home, here's our H1, here's our paragraph tag. So we can change this. Let's say we take this link, let's say we take this link out and we say, learn about ASP.NET with Rich. And take out. So we can note, I'm just making an HTML change here. Notice it automatically updates. I didn't even refresh. I just came back. So this stuff up here, wherever we see this @ symbol that Visual Studio highlights in yellow, this is our server-side code. So kind of the equivalent of opening and closing PHP tags on a page. So this syntax is called Razer Syntax, and it's actually a lot simpler than the PHP syntax in our views. So here's the content for our index page. Here's the content for our privacy view. So notice we've got a little bit of server-side code, use this, and then some HTML. But when we look at these pages in the browser, they've actually got a header and footer. Right? So where is this stuff? Where is the header and footer? Because we don't see it. There's no header, there's no footer here. So where do you suppose that header and footer would be? How do we find it? And then we want to make some changes to, let's say, the header and footer of the site. Where do you suppose those would be? Because they're not in the individual views. There's no header here, no header or footer here. So see if you can find, in Solution Explorer, see if you can find the file that would have the header and or the footer. Let me know in the chat if you've found it. Because we view this page in the browser, we've got all this code. We got head tags, bootstrap, navbar with links.
We're supposed to find the header, right?
Yeah, so where's the file or files that give us this whole layout? Because we don't see it in the index or privacy views. It's got to be somewhere.
It's in the layout.
Right, and what folder is that in, Chris?
Shared.
Right, so under views and shared, we've got this underscore layout. And here it is. So it takes the name of our project, puts it in the browser title, also prints it in our navbar. Here's where our page content gets injected inside the main tag, and then we've got this footer down at the bottom. So let's make a change here. In our header, instead of saying Thursday lesson 1, we just want this to say lesson space 1. So on line 14, I'm going to change this text from Thursday underscore lesson 1. I'm just going to change it to say lesson 1. So we can make whatever changes we want in terms of content, layout, or design, but this file gives us a starting point. And now it just says lesson 1. There are a couple of other files here I'll show you. We'll work with them later in the course, but not today. But I will show them to you. We have this appsettings.json file. And this is for storing configuration variables like a database connection or API keys, which we're going to use later when we enable things like Google and Microsoft sign-in. We might have mail server credentials, so our application can send email. So we would store those things in this JSON file. We also have this startup file where we can configure things, how our application should run. So for example, when new users register, it's currently set up that they can't log in until they confirm their email. So we might change that. It's configuring a connection to SQL Server. Every time. Yeah, okay, David, it is, and I'll explain why. Are you using start debugging or start without debugging? Okay, so remember I mentioned how .NET, we'll take a break in a minute, but talked about how one of the big benefits of .NET is that the code is compiled. So what does this mean? It means all of the C# code, not the HTML, but any server-side code written in C# actually gets compiled down to binary code. And our application runs on the binary. So where does the binary code live? I will show you. So you notice here the list of folders in my Solution Explorer, but here's my project in Windows. Now notice in Windows, I have this bin folder that we don't see in Visual Studio. So what's the purpose of the bin folder? If I open it up, go into Debug in .NET 5, these are all of the Microsoft libraries, code libraries that our application uses. And down here is this file, lesson1.dll, dynamic link library. This is the compiled version of the file. So the ones and zeros, that's secure and runs fast. So David, the reason why when you make a change, it may be slow for a minute is when we make a change, it recompiles or rebuilds the DLL. So it rebuilds this compiled locked version of the code. So the first time we request a new version, it can be a bit slow. But then subsequently it runs much faster. Yeah, so there's that little delay. And as our application gets bigger, the build process kind of takes longer to do. But that's why we have that little hiccup or delay after we save a change. So nothing to worry about. So the benefit of the ones and zeros is the web server can run the ones and zeros a heck of a lot faster than it can process code like this, where it has to interpret every line of code. One of the other great things about compiling code is if we make syntax errors in our code, let's say here, I forget a semicolon. Visual Studio not only tells me I'm missing it, but I can't actually compile the project. If I go to build it, it goes, nope, you are missing a semicolon here. So we actually can't build the code with syntax errors. So this catches a lot of our coding errors when we're working. In PHP, the only way we find out with errors is we run it in the browser and the site crashes. But compiled code catches a lot of our mistakes at the time we're working. So it reduces errors greatly and reduces debugging time. So now I'll build. It tells me my build succeeded, and we can see that the DLL just got updated. I know this is all new, so if you find this is confusing, don't stress. All right, it's 12:52, so I'd like to take another 10-minute break here. And then when we come back, I don't think we're going to be here for like another full hour, 50 minutes to an hour. but I want to make a few more changes, and I want to try making a few pages and adding a few links. Again, to give you a bit of a feel for how do we work with MVC and get a better sense of what the workflow is like. Okay, so really simple examples. I won't overwhelm you with it. Okay, so I will stop the recording here. We'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back and we'll add a few pages and links, and then we will call it a day. Okay, we will be back in 10.